Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the geology of the South Nicholson region. And there's really three things that I wanted to cover in this talk. So this is sort of how I've organized it. The first one is revisions to a forthcoming map from NTGS. It's a 1 to 250,000 scale map called Mount Drummond, and we'll soon be producing the third edition of that map. Um, a lot of the revisions that have been made on the third edition map compared to the second edition map were made on the basis of detrital zircon geochronology. So I thought it would be appropriate to show a compilation of some of these data and discuss some ways in which we might be able to use them in a way that's actually useful for stratigraphy. And then the last thing is I wanted to talk about some relatively recent drilling, meaning I think roughly 2 years ago, in this area and what those results were. All right, before I go any farther, I want to acknowledge all of these people, all of these organizations. Most of them are partners on the ARC linkage grant into the Greater MacArthur Basin. Geoscience Australia has done a massive amount of work in the South Nicholson region, and they've been really instrumental in some of the revisions that we've made to the Mount Drummond map. So I definitely want to acknowledge them. I've highlighted Resolution Minerals and Tech Australia because they were the ones that drilled the holes that I'll be discussing. And as always, want to acknowledge the University of Adelaide group for all the stuff that they have done. And I'll be talking about a little bit of their data. Okay, so this is a map that shows the South Nicholson region. It's in the eastern part of the Northern Territory and extends into Queensland. Some things to take note of on this map, just for reference, are Mount Isa down to the southeast, the MacArthur Basin in the north, and the Tennant Creek region to the southwest. So the South Nicholson region sort of lies, in between these three things. Um, this map shows the outlines of 9 1 to 250,000 scale geological maps. The one in the center is Mount Drummond, and I'm going to be showing several different maps during this presentation. So to try to keep us all oriented, I put the outline of Mount Drummond onto all of them. And then what's shown in the red rectangle is the outline of the map that will be on the next slide. Okay, so the stratigraphy of this area has been subdivided into a lot of detail, but I thought it might be most useful to discuss this in sort of the most generalized ways. And so there's a very generalized, simple stratigraphic column on the left that shows the four major subdivisions that we can make of the stratigraphy in this area. So the oldest rocks in the area are in the Murphy province. Those are igneous and metamorphic rocks, or Paleoproterozoic. They're overlain by strata of the Lawn Hill platform. It's predominantly Paleoproterozoic, but extends a bit into the Mesoproterozoic. Those are overlain by exclusively Mesoproterozoic rocks of the South Nicholson Basin. Those in turn are overlain by some early Neoproterozoic to Paleozoic rocks of the Georgina Basin. So the colors on the strat column on the left are the same as on the map to the right. In addition to that, the map on the right shows an orange area. That's the Tuala group of the MacArthur Basin. And then the youngest rocks in the area are Cretaceous rocks of the Carpentaria Basin. All right, so the stratigraphy of this region has different names in different places. So the names that I just went through are the names that are shown on here for the South Nicholson region. So essentially the South Nicholson group underlain by the Lawn Hill platform. And the Lawn Hill platform itself is divided into different groups. If you go off to the east into the Mount Isa province, that's shown on the right of this diagram, the same stratigraphy is divided into a series of superbasins. If you go to the north into the southern MacArthur Basin, the same stratigraphy is divided into a series of different groups. And then in addition to that, there's this package nomenclature that a lot of you may be familiar with. And so this diagram basically shows how all of those things correlate with each other. And I've highlighted on here with a couple of stars the stratigraphic position of HYC, which we just heard about, and also the Century deposit, which is to the east of Mount Drummond in Queensland. All right, so this is a very generalized view of the Mount Drummond map, the second edition version on the left and the third edition version on the right. So this is just showing the distinction between Lawn Hill Platform and South Nicholson Group. So you can see that the major change going from the second edition map into the third edition map is that a lot of what had been referred to as South Nicholson Group in the second edition has now been reassigned to the Lawn Hill platform. So what that means is that on the third edition map, there's sort of a wide, broad distribution of Lawn Hill platform rocks. And conversely, there is a lesser distribution of South Nicholson Group rocks. I've put two drill holes on here. The one in the southeast is NDI Carrera 1, which is sort of a famous drill hole for a lot of people here. And the one in the north is one that I'll be discussing later in the talk. All right, so like I said, a lot of these revisions were made based on detrital zircon geochronology. And so I wanted to show an example of the use of detrital zircon geochronology for interpreting some of these things. All right, so this is a compilation of detrital zircon samples that we've put together at NTGS. So the sample locations are shown as the red dots on the map. You can see that most of them are concentrated in and around the Mount Drummond map, where they actually extend over a very wide range. So there's 88 samples in this compilation. All of the data in the compilation are data that were originally either from Geoscience Australia or from NTGS. They're in a whole host of geochronology records. If anybody really wants to know the details, just talk to me afterwards. Um, the depositional ages of the rocks in the database vary. The oldest rocks in the compiled database are from the Murphy province, and the youngest rocks are from the Bacallara sandstone, which is early Neoproterozoic from the Georgina Basin. All right, so there's 88 samples in this compilation of detrital zircon data. Each one of those samples will have a detrital zircon age distribution. I'm sure you've all seen the age spectra plots. Each one of those will have been generated by dating something like 80 to 100 detrital zircon. So you start multiplying this out, and it gets to be a relatively large amount of data. And so in order to really evaluate that data, we need to reduce the dimensionality of the data using some sort of statistical method. And so that's what the next graph is going to show. All right, so on this graph, each dot represents one of those detrital zircon age populations, right? So instead of showing a spectrum, we can reduce that down and compress the data to basically a single point, and its position on the graph has some meaning. And that meaning is that samples with similar age distributions will plot close to each other. Samples that have age distributions that are very dissimilar will plot far away from each other. So we need some reference points on this graph. So to create the reference points, let's take the one in the upper left hand for example. That's basically a made up detrital zircon age spectrum that has a single peak that is at 1900 MA. Right? There's another point for basically the same thing at 1800, 1700, and 1600. So now what we can do is start looking at the actual data and see how these data might cluster, and then think about how could we use this to do something maybe meaningful. All right, so as it turns out, all of the samples from the Murphy province plot in that green oval. There's also some samples that are not from the Murphy province that are also in that green oval. There are two samples in the database from the Georgina Basin, and they plot down there. Right, so those two things are basically define our N members. And it's not probably not coincidental that that is the oldest unit and the youngest unit. Right, so those are our N members. All of the data from the South Nicholson Basin plot into the blue oval, along with some data that are not from the South Nicholson Basin. And then the samples from the Lawn Hill platform and the MacArthur Basin basically plot in this array that goes from the left-hand side of the graph over to the right-hand side of the graph. All right, so we're going to come back to this. So what we've done so far is basically establish this reference that just shows us empirically where do detrital zircon samples from these different units plot on this graph. And we'll come back to it with some new data and see how it compares. All right, so that brings me to two drill holes that I'll discuss that were drilled a couple years ago by Tech. Bunge actually mentioned these this morning. I'm just going to focus on two of them. All right, so on this map, you can see the outline of Mount Drummond. Off to the east, you've got the Century deposit. Up to the north, you have the MacArthur Basin. All the lines on this map are seismic lines. So the two drill holes that I will be discussing are those two red dots. And an important thing on this map is that what's shown in pink or purple is the outline of the Carrara subbasin. And that outline was drawn based around a gravity low, and it was drawn before that southern seismic line was acquired. So if you look at this map, it's pretty clear that those two drill holes are outside of the Carrara subbasin. So the next thing that we'll look at is a composite seismic image that's defined by the thick blue line. It's actually three seismic lines that are put together. All right, so here's that seismic line. The two drill holes are shown on the right. I've highlighted them with blue stars. I actually drew the actual drill holes in red lines, but because of the scale of this, it's so deep that they don't show up particularly well. All right, so you can see in this view, you can see the Carrara subbasin pretty clearly on the right-hand side of the diagram. It's labeled at the top. And so based on the seismic image, these are sort of right in the middle of the Carrara subbasin. And so I guess the lesson from all of that is that things like basin outlines are going to change over time, basically as we get more and better data. All right, so for these two drill holes, there were 6 detrital zircon samples collected, and in the drill hole on the left, so it starts off with Georgina Basin at the top of the drill hole, and it drills into the Lawton Hill platform. All right. The drill hole on the right also starts off in the Georgina Basin, goes down into the South Nicholson group, and then at the bottom of the hole, there's Lawton Hill platform. So in other words, the major differences between these two drill holes is that the one on the right has a South Nicholson group intersection, and the one on the left does not. So if we go back to the detrital zircon data from those two holes, this is where they would plot on our graph that we made earlier. So the two samples that have been logged as being in the South Nicholson group, sure enough, plot in the South Nicholson Basin blue oval. The 4 detrital zircon samples that are not from the South Nicholson group plot outside of that. So in this case, it looks like maybe it's this kind of analysis of the data could be useful for us when we're trying to determine lithostratigraphy. Also, if we go back to the seismic line, if you look closely, the yellow line on the interpretation is the base of the South Nicholson group. So you can see over on the right-hand side of the image, there's sort of like 2 depot centers that are separated by an intervening high of the Lawn Hill platform. And based on the seismic interpretation, you probably say that the drill hole on the right drilled through the margin of one of those depot centers, went through the South Nicholson group, and the second one drilled into the intervening high. So it seems like in this case, everything is consistent. The stratigraphic logging, the detrital zircon results, and the seismic interpretation are all consistent with each other. Okay, so there's one more drill hole that I wanted to mention, and that's this one, 23 BNM 003. There was some detrital zircon work that was done on this through the University of Adelaide, an honors thesis, I believe, from Lee, finished just last year. And so in this drill hole, uh, the intersections were in the McNamara group of the Lawn Hill platform and the underlying Carrara range group of the Lawn Hill platform. So there's a couple of high logger photos from this drill hole. The upper one shows some sort of organic rich looking siltstones of the Lawn Hill Formation from the drill hole. And the bottom one shows these beautiful volcaniclastic rocks of what we now call the Buddy Carrara Formation, but which used to be known as the Buddy Carrara Volcanics. All right, just to summarize the results from those drill holes, the tech drill holes, the BRK holes, both of them intersected Lawn Hill Platform, and one of them intersected the South Nicholson Group. And from what Tim Munson tells me, not only did it intersect the South Nicholson Group, it intersected a complete section, a succession of the South Nicholson Group. The Resolution Minerals drill hole intersected both the McNamara Group and the underlying Carrara Range Group of the Lawn Hill Platform. Okay, so just to conclude, the points that I wanted to get across are number one, on the third edition of Mount Drummond, many areas that were previously mapped as South Nicholson Basin have been reassigned to the Lawn Hill Platform. The implication of that is that, at least within that map sheet, there seems to be a very broad distribution of Lawn Hill Platform rocks with a relative beneath a relatively shallow cover. Some of the recent drilling results have intersected Lawn Hill Platform, both within Mount Drummond and just to the south of Mount Drummond. And one of the tech drill holes intersected a complete section of the South Nicholson Group. So that's all.